okay at the back? Yeah, okay. So we are looking for a roaming mic, but for the moment we're going to stay around this microphone just to make sure. If at any point you can't hear anyone, just put your hand up and we'll make sure that we're closer to the mic and so on. So welcome everybody. It's really lovely to see so many of you here this morning. We've managed to bring a beautiful sunny day again, which is wonderful because it means we can have lunch in the courtyard like we did last year. Today the focus is going to be on pupil diversity, and really this meeting is all about kind of crosstalk between us as researchers and you guys as practitioners. So we're hoping very much to hear what you have to say about the research that we've been doing here in the Department of Psychology at Royal Holloway. If you are a Twitterati, then there's some information about tweeting up here. So there's a hashtag, no less, and all of our handles. And they're also on the programme that you should have. So feel free to tweet about things if that's your thing. So just a little bit of housekeeping then, just to run through the programme. So we're going to have a couple of talks this morning from myself and Kathy Rastle on literacy. We'll have a team coffee break. Then we're going to have a few talks on mental health after the break. There'll then be lunch, and you can have a look at the posters that are displayed out in the foyer. There'll be a photo at the end of the lunch break, and what we'll do for that is gather in the courtyard. If you were here last year, you'll know, but just kind of move towards the courtyard at about 1:45. And then this afternoon, we're going to have two discussion groups, which will be in the two rooms that are immediately opposite. So there's 170 and 171. Okay, so they're carefully labelled. There's plenty of people around to ask if you're not sure exactly where you're going. But literacy will be in 170 and mental health in 171. And then we'll come back together at the end for some final remarks. You've seen where the refreshments are, so where the tea and coffee is at the moment, that's where the lunch will be served, and feel free to sit wherever you like. Most of you, I think, have found the toilets, but if you haven't, they are through the double doors just down this way, and there are signs. If those are full, there are more toilets upstairs as well. If you have any questions, then kind of come and ask one of us. There are lots of people milling around who are based here. And do, if you have time and inclination, have a look around our campus. There's still a little bit of building work, not as much as last year, but a little bit of building work going on. But it is a really beautiful campus, a really beautiful founders building up at the top, so feel free to kind of make yourself at home today. Now, hopefully you will have all picked up a feedback form when you came in. If you haven't, make sure you grab one at some point, and please remember to fill that in at the end of the day, because that's really important for us in terms of getting some feedback about how the day's gone and anything that we can improve for next year. Okay, so that's all from me in terms of housekeeping, so I'm going to hand over to our first chair, Helen Pote.
Hello, welcome. I'm Helen Pote, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Psychology here. And I'm absolutely delighted to introduce this session on literacy because there's so much fantastic research going on in literacy in the department, both in primary and secondary schools, and I hope we'll show you that diversity today. So we're beginning with Dr. Jessie Ricketts, who's a Senior Lecturer, and she's going to present her work on vocabulary and reading in secondary schools, the VARIS project, which has been taking up an enormous amount of your time recently. So I'm looking forward to those results.
Okay, thank you very much, Helen. Yes, I first started thinking about this project, I think, about 5 years ago. And it's just about coming to an end. So it was funded by the ESRC, and the funding period, so the project really finishes in July. So actually it's a really important moment for this project. We've collected all of the data and we're still kind of looking at various aspects of it. But I'm hoping to give you a bit of a snapshot today on what we've found that gets at this issue of pupil diversity. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. Now, the project is called the Vocabulary and Reading in Secondary School Project, and VARIS for short. And it was motivated by a number of things. So when I started thinking about this, I'd just been working on a project working with children with speech, language and communication needs and autism, and working across primary and secondary schools, and thinking very much about transition amongst other things. And one of the things I really encountered on working with SENCOs, special educational needs coordinators, within that project was that those Senkos who were working in secondary school were talking to me a lot about the literacy and language difficulties that their pupils had, and about the sense that they just didn't really know what to do with those pupils and didn't have the kinds of materials that they wanted to have to support them. So that really was at the heart of what motivated this project. And I think it's fair to say, and this won't be news for anyone, that adequate oral vocabulary knowledge and reading is really crucial for accessing the curriculum, both at primary and at secondary. But I think one of the things that's really important about secondary school is this focus on independence and reading to learn. So what we need in secondary school, ideally, is pupils who have the requisite reading skills that they need to learn from what they're reading. And that's something that I think is really becomes more important through primary, and it's really important in secondary school. So clearly reading is fundamental. And clearly poor oral vocabulary and poor reading is going to be a barrier to exam performance as well. At the end of secondary school, our kids sit very high stakes exams, and you know, how well they do in those exams is going to depend to quite a large degree, I think, on their reading and vocabulary abilities as well as the knowledge that they've accumulated. So I'm focusing today on vocabulary and reading, but of course there are other aspects of language and literacy that are also important. But I was particularly interested in a gap in the field, in the research literature, and also in practice, I felt, on a kind of more of a focus on oral vocabulary and reading in secondary school, and that's what motivated this Varus project. So I'm going to start with a diagram that might be familiar to some of you, especially those who have trained more recently, which shows the simple view of reading. And this is just a kind of framework for conceptualizing reading in a kind of fairly simple way, hence the title, Simple View of Reading. And at the crux of this is the idea that reading comprehension is the product of word reading and language comprehension. And the reason why it's a product is because both of those things are necessary, and neither on their own are sufficient. So if you can't read words, clearly you can't be a good reader, you can't access text. Equally though, even if you can read words quite well, if you haven't got the kind of oral language comprehension skills that you need, you're not going to be a good reader. So both of those things are essential, in other words. Now, we often think about the simple view in terms of these two dimensions in multi-dimensional space like this, mainly because it helps us to think about the utility of this framework. So essentially, when you're thinking about any of the pupils in your classroom, you can expect that they will fall somewhere in this multi-dimensional space. So typically what we see is children that have poor word reading that goes along with poor language comprehension going up to average and to skilled word reading and language comprehension. So that's a kind of typical profile with those two things coupling together. But we also see somewhat dissociated profiles with children that have more specific difficulties with either word reading or with language comprehension. And that's the kind of diversity that we expect to see within the classroom. I'm going to be focusing in on one aspect of language comprehension of oral language, and that's vocabulary today. And actually, particularly at secondary, once kind of foundational skills for most pupils at least are fairly well established, vocabulary is really, really crucial in this picture. It's a crucial variable for explaining the diversity amongst pupils. And it varies enormously. So in this project, the Varus project, what I was really interested in trying to capture across the various different studies that I did was the reciprocity in the relationship between oral vocabulary and reading. So oral vocabulary knowledge feeds into reading comprehension. Like, you can make a kind of fairly logical argument that in order to fully understand a text that you're reading, you might need to understand all of the words that are in that text. So I think that's quite a straightforward argument to make. But I've also been interested in the kind of flip side of that, so thinking about how reading feeds into growth in vocabulary. And I've looked at that in two ways, so thinking about how pupils learn new words while they're reading. So they're reading text, they see words they don't know. What is the process that allows them to learn something new about those words? And I've also been interested in a slightly different take on this question, which is to think about whether we can harness children's reading skills in order to support their learning of new words. So I guess this is a kind of proxy for a teacher or speech and language therapist working with a child or group of children, writing down or presenting the visual form of a word when they're teaching what that word sounds like and what it means. And that does seem to help children to learn new words. Now I'm not going to focus on that side of things today, because what I'm going to talk about is diversity, and focusing very much on the longitudinal project that I conducted to look at development in reading and development in vocabulary across the first 3 years of secondary school. So following pupils up from year 7 through year 8 and into year 9. So that's what I'm going to focus on today, but just to give you a sense of the project. And come back next year and I'm sure I will talk about some of these other aspects. Okay, so a little bit more information then about the longitudinal study. So it's a pretty large study. We worked with approximately 200 pupils, and we spent about 6 hours with each of those pupils across the 3 years. So actually that's an incredibly detailed data set that we have on these pupils, which is really exciting. And as I said, we followed them up from year 7 into year 8 and into year 9. They're now currently in year 10, and we're going to be following them up to see how they get on at GCSE as well, which is really exciting next year. So at the beginning of the project, we had about 200 pupils. We've actually had very little attrition in the course of the project, very little kind of dropout, which is mainly a testament to Nikki Dawson and Lucy Taylor, the 2 research assistants working on the project, and also to the fantastic support from the schools, and we have representatives from all 3 schools here today. So we've done very, very well to keep pupils in the project, which is always the big risk with a big longitudinal study like this. This graph at the bottom right here is just to show you that it's a representative sample. So what we have here on the x-axis is the percentage of children in receipt of free school meals on the Special Educational Needs Register and speaking English as an additional language. And the bars in orange relate to our Varus sample, and the grey bars relate to kind of national and regional data. And just to show you that things look fairly similar to what we would expect nationally and regionally. So this was a completely unselected group. We just went for whoever we found in these schools. So as I said, we spent 6 hours, so 2 hours per year with each of the pupils, and what we did in that time is we measured oral vocabulary and reading. We did that in various different ways to try and make sure that we get a really good sense of a pupil's true ability, so using lots of different measures so that we can triangulate on their true ability. So we measured nonverbal reasoning just as a measure of general cognitive ability. We measured oral vocabulary. We had 2 measures, and importantly they captured kind of comprehension, so reception, expression as well, production of word meanings. They also captured the extent to which children knew about individual words, so the depth of their knowledge, what they knew about the words, as well as the breadth, as well as how many words they knew. We wanted to make sure that we had a really good sense of their oral vocabulary knowledge. In terms of word reading, we had 6 measures. And those measures allowed us to look at non-word reading, so pure decoding skills, phonics skills, regular word reading, so reading of words that are spelt the way that they sound, spelt in a kind of fairly obvious way, like cat, reading of irregular words, so that's words that are spelt in a kind of unusual, unexpected way, all of the kind of weird and wonderful words that we have in the English language, like island and yacht, and so on. And we also, across these measures, could look at accuracy, so how well they read words, but also efficiency. And that's really crucial because it's only when children can read not only accurately, but also efficiently, that they kind of free up cognitive resources for comprehension, so they can really become smart readers. I think that's the roving mic coming in now. And finally, we had 4 measures of reading comprehension taken from one particular task. And it was really important to have lots of measures of reading comprehension. It's notoriously difficult to measure. So it was really important to have a kind of lots of measures so that we could be fairly confident and reliable. Okay, that's great. I think I'll continue to use this one. Lovely. Thank you very much. But it was also important to capture the kind of individual differences, the kind of diversity that we were expecting to see in secondary. So based on previous kind of cross-sectional studies comparing different age groups, we were expecting to see quite a wide range, actually. Ranging from levels that you would expect from an average kind of 6-year-old, right up to almost adult-like levels in these 12-year-olds and then 13 and 14-year-olds. And that, in fact, that's what we did see, and I'll be showing you that in a minute. So we needed to have a reading comprehension measure that would span that kind of variation, which wasn't straightforward at all. And for that reason, we spent an entire hour every year assessing reading comprehension, which I think was really important and very unique to this project. Okay, so the assessments that we used were standardised assessments that we often use in psychological research. And they were standardised in two ways, and this was really important. So they were standardised in the way that they were administered. And that's important because it means that every pupil has the same opportunity to do well, really. So you have standard instructions and everybody gets the same deal. They were also standardised in the sense that they were norm referenced. So we had a good sense from the publishers of the test and the data that they'd collected of how children in a particular age group should perform on this particular assessment. So when you then use it with your pupil, I'm sure many of you have used standardised assessments, you can then you compare your individual pupil with what we're expecting, with age expectations. So that's important. And as with any kind of human characteristic that we might measure, what you would expect to see is a normal distribution like this. So approximately 68%, most of the kids in what we call an average range, in the middle here, so that's the orange bit here. So we're expecting children to vary quite a lot, but within that average range, that age expected range. And about 16% of children to fall below that range, and about 16% above that range. And as I've mentioned, we use more than one, we tried to get at each thing, at vocabulary, at word reading, at reading comprehension, in more than one way. So we could get a really good picture of what was happening with each pupil. And how they were growing over time as well, how they were developing. Now I'm going to show you quite a few graphs that look a bit like this, and so I'm going to take some time just to explain this in quite a lot of detail. Lots of you will be familiar with looking at graphs like this, but for those of you who are not, I'll take you through it a little bit more slowly. So this is just an example from the WASI vocabulary, so that's the expressive vocabulary measure, where children just have to explain the meanings of words. So what does police mean, for example? And they get a score on the basis of their response. So this is their raw score, so that just reflects their accuracy, how much they know about the words that we ask them about. Along the x-axis we've got phases, so this is phase 1 when they're 12, year 7, phase 2, 13, and phase 3, 14, when they're in year 9. And what I could have done is to have plotted an individual line for each of the 200 pupils in the project. But actually I did do that, and it looks pretty messy. It's really hard to interpret. So what I've done instead is to group children in 10% groups, so groups of about 20. And so this dark line at the bottom is the lowest performing 10%. That's the way to read this graph. And as you go up and the lines get lighter, performance is getting greater. So what you have at the top here with this fainter line is the top performing 10%. So hopefully that makes sense. So that's how you can read it. And the way to think about the diversity is the variation across those lines going up. Okay. Now in blue, what we have is the average performance across the group in the 3 years. And that's really useful as well, because that shows us how much average growth we've got year on year. And what you can see is that the scores are going up a little bit, but not an enormous amount. And actually that's quite a common theme. A little bit of growth, but not an enormous amount of growth. And then there's this grey dashed line here, which is just really a reference to give you a little bit more information about what these lowest performing children look like. And in every graph what you'll see is that even by the age of 14, this lowest 10 or sometimes more like 20% are not reaching the kind of level that we would expect from an average 9-year-old. And remember, they're 14 by the end of the project, so that's really important, I think. That's a really important message. So I'm going to show you a few more graphs that look a little bit like this. But the main theme, the kind of take-home message across all of the graphs actually, is that we see a little bit of growth over time, and you can see that by looking at the crosses and also by looking at the slope of the lines. Not an enormous amount of growth, which incidentally is kind of what we were expecting, but there weren't good data out there showing this. There's a lots of variation amongst the pupils, ranging from, and at the bottom here we've got children who look like the average 6-year-old, right up to near adult levels. Importantly, this bottom group of children don't seem to be catching up with their peers, and you can see that from the kind of parallel nature of the lines. If they were catching up, you'd see more of a funneling towards the end. So moving on to look not only at, so this is the graph that I just showed you, and this graph here just represents vocabulary in terms of the kind of breadth measure, so the number of words that children know. And just to show you that across both of those measures, we're not seeing an enormous amount of growth, some, but not much. The lines are fairly parallel, so no catching up of the poorest performing, and large individual differences, so lots of pupil diversity there. Incidentally, the kind of growth that we're seeing and the kind of performance levels that we're seeing are absolutely in line with what we'd expect on the basis of these standardised tests. But it's really interesting to see that in a sample where you're following the same children up over time. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of a sense of what's happening with these lowest performing 10% then, this darkest line at the bottom, which you'll see in all of the graphs incidentally that it's a little bit separated from the rest of the lines. So there does seem to be a something kind of interesting about this bottom group. Just to give you a sense of the words that they were struggling with, so words like canine, polluting, illumination, decade, tradition, and enthusiastic. So it's somewhat surprising really to see them struggling with those kinds of words. Perhaps not to you guys, but I was somewhat surprised by some of these items. Okay, so moving on then to think about what's happening in terms of word reading. And here we've got some measures of word reading efficiency at the top here. This is non-word reading efficiency, so decoding efficiency based on phonics knowledge. And this is a measure of word reading accuracy. But essentially they all kind of triangulate on the same thing, on word reading abilities. And again, we see fairly limited growth. We see quite parallel lines in terms of word reading. And we see that these lowest performing kids don't seem to be catching up with their peers. So what does this look like in real terms? So this is one of the measures that we use to assess word reading ability. So this is the TOWRI. I don't know if any of you have come across it. And essentially what they have to do is read as many words as they can in 45 seconds. And those pupils who are in that bottom kind of 10 or 20% were in 45 seconds getting to somewhere between part and contain. So they're not able to read that many words, as you will see. So here we are here. So about 40 to 50 items in 45 seconds. Okay, and that's really not going to leave that much for comprehension at the end of that process. Okay, so moving on then to think about reading comprehension. So what we have here are the 4 passages that we use from the reading comprehension task that we used. And this is a task that's aimed at 7 to 8-year-olds. So this was our easy passage, if you like, to try and capture those at the bottom end of the distribution. And these are our age-appropriate ones. The 1.1 and 1.2, these are age-appropriate, and this is the difficult passage aimed at Key Stage 4. So we had a full range of different passages for them to do. And I think the really important take-home message, other than this pattern of not an enormous amount of growth and parallel lines, is thinking about this supplementary passage. Okay, so this is the passage that we asked them to read. So I'll just read you a little bit of it. It was the first day of Ryan's family holiday. They were staying in a cottage which overlooked the harbour in Peel Bay. It was a glorious sunny day, so the family had wandered down on the beach. And I'm sure Nikki and others working on this project would know this passage by heart now. And in fact, the kids, I think, get to know these passages over time. But importantly, they're then asked 8 questions, or actually 13 in this version questions, about this passage. And most of those questions rely on information that's literally stated within the text, and some of them rely on kind of inferences to be made from across the text. But really what we're seeing in relation to this passage is that there are many of the pupils who are not at mastery with this passage that's aimed at these much younger children. So hopefully all of this is coming together to suggest to you that actually there are quite a lot of children within this distribution who are going to have difficulty accessing the curriculum. And in order to try and illustrate that, I've just selected a couple of pieces from Year 7 curriculum. So of course this is right at the beginning of the project, and the curriculum will become more and more challenging as they move up into Year 9. So what we can see here is an extract from Goodnight Mr. Tom. I'm sure lots of you are familiar with that story. And this is an extract from a science textbook here. So I'm just going to focus in on this very briefly, just to say at no point in this text is the word satellite defined. So if you're coming to this text and you don't understand the word satellite, you're going to be really lost. And I think it's very likely that those pupils at the bottom end of the distribution will be struggling with those kinds of words, those content-specific words. Okay, so a little bit of a summary then, and we should have plenty of time for questions. So, lots of individual differences, lots of diversity. And I've also looked at relationships between these different variables and so on. I'm happy to talk about that more if you're interested. But I've focused very much on trying to capture this diversity, of which there is an enormous amount. So as a secondary teacher, those of you who are secondary teachers, you are having to manage a class that includes pupils who are reading at the kind of level you'd expect from a 6 or 7-year-old, right up to those who are really flying with their reading. The poorest performing are not, kind of even by the end of the project when they're 14, exceeding the kind of levels that we would expect from a 9-year-old. They don't seem to be catching up with their peers, and we've looked at used various different statistical techniques to look at this, and there isn't significant catching up of that group. There is an increased risk if you're in that bottom performing 10 or 20% to be in receipt of free school meals or on the special education needs register, but I think really crucially not all of the children in that group fall into the free school meals or the SEN group. So there are pupils within that group who are not attracting any additional attention and resources. They probably are, but officially at least, they're not. And we don't see an enormous amount of growth in these kind of foundational vocabulary and reading skills. So of course they're learning lots of information in secondary school. So the gap between the poorest and highest achievers doesn't seem to be closing in the early secondary years. It's a kind of headline from this. And that the vocabulary and reading difficulties, hopefully I've persuaded you of this, will be a barrier to accessing the kind of curriculum that they then face, and potentially a barrier to performing well in their high stakes exams as well. And that's something we'll be looking at with the next phase of the project, looking at GCSEs and equivalents. There is some progress in these foundational skills, but it is quite limited, and as I've said, of course they're learning lots of things, but this is not the stuff that they seem to be learning lots of. And I guess it's fair to say, from talking to lots of teachers and lots of practitioners working in secondary school, that the focus in secondary school really isn't inputting into their foundational vocabulary and reading skills. The focus is slightly different, and that's kind of considered more the mainstay of what's happening in primary education. And actually, I'll come back to what I said at the very beginning, which is that the teachers that I've been working with, there's a sense in which they don't feel that they have the knowledge and skills and materials in order to support these children kind of at the bottom end of the range. Okay, so just to say an enormous thank you to the 3 schools that have been involved in this project, so it's Cox Green, Embrook and Garth Hill, and of course the pupils and teachers and so on, and to the large group of research assistants that worked on this project collecting all of this data. And thank you very much for listening. Yeah, we will put them all on the, we'll put all of the slides on the website afterwards. It's here, yeah.
Great. Right, so we've got about 5 minutes for questions, if anyone would like to ask Jessie any questions at this point.
Your studies, do you have any correlations with Harold Christensen's decoding program? It's the 45-second time trial she also uses.
Oh, okay, that's very interesting. We haven't recorded whether they're involved in that program at all, but that's something we could ask the schools about. Thank you.
Yeah. Are you putting forward any recommendations? Are you kind of saying that we should be focusing on literacy skills, vocabulary skills?
Are you working in a secondary school?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so, yes. I think there are certainly, I would say that there is a sense in which we could move the whole distribution up. So not just those who are performing really poorly, but everybody. So I think there is a need for whole school cross-curricular kind of approaches, but also targeted approaches, importantly.
There's quite a lot of research happening, kind of, I think, in Birmingham, to the schools there, on literacy. And
the Aston Literacy Project, I'm involved in that project too, yeah.
So, I mean, going back to kind of this satellite example, surely that's also the role of the teacher to explain what satellite is.
Yeah.
And certainly I know over the last couple of years we've been trying to focus on the literacy within my own lessons. And saying, I don't assume that they understand each word, especially in psychology. There's lots of words that are new to them. So, I mean,
I think that's a really important message. So it's about knowing, not assuming that all of the pupils in your classroom will understand some words that seem quite straightforward to you. And lots of teachers do know that, but I think, you know, that perhaps it's about raising awareness across teachers and across schools. I think my experience is that there are lots of really excellent things happening in secondary schools to try and promote all of these things, but what we're not seeing is a kind of a policy-based approach, you know, a kind of a policy-based emphasis on raising standards, which I think we could be seeing. And so we have been working with policymakers at the DFE and to try and encourage them to think about secondary as well as primary when it comes to reading and these foundational skills. Because they are very concerned, actually. They're particularly concerned at the moment about the kind of the post-16 group that leave school and really don't have the basic skills that they need to get a job and so on. So yes, I do think that we could be doing more. I think the big question is about what we should be doing and what best practice is, and actually there I don't think we know. I think there is lots of good practice going on, but we need more evidence about what best practice looks like for promoting these skills in secondary school. That's what
Great. Just one more question.
Yeah, so I was going to ask, are you going to suggest some materials and ways forward?
So that's the next stage of the project. So this project was all about, we don't know anything about what's going on in secondary, except for the stuff that the government reports and also the knowledge that teachers have within their heads, of course, much knowledge about the pupils that they work with. But there wasn't any kind of available data about what was going on at this point. So this project was really a scoping project to see what the picture looks like. But yes, the next stage, and this is what the workshop, for those of you who are coming to the language and literacy workshop this afternoon, one of the focuses of that will be to think a little bit about strategies and materials. That's absolutely the next stage. And trying to bring together all of that good practice and learn from that and share that good practice as well. I mean, that's absolutely the next stage. The other thing that I'm really focusing on is if you had a close look at the words that I showed you that they might not know the meanings of, I think those words don't necessarily capture the words that are most aligned with the curriculum that they need to know. And so that's the other really important kind of future step, is trying to align this much more with the curriculum in the way that things are measured.
Okay, thank you. Let's thank Jessie once again for really
Yes, please.
continue with the next presentation, and I'm delighted to introduce Professor Kathy Rastle, Head of Department here in the Department of Psychology, and she's going to be presenting her work on Do Children Need Explicit Instruction in Learning to Read? Thank you, Kathy.
And thank you for coming, everyone. So my lab, we don't actually study children. We study fundamental aspects of learning and language and reading in adults, but I think that the conclusions that we draw from this sort of research can be applied to children, particularly in the area of reading, because as we know, there is no critical period for reading acquisition. So the way that adults acquire reading, everything we know about how that happens in the brain translates to what we know about children. So what I wanted to do today is to share with you some of the work that we're doing just on looking at how well do people learn to appreciate different kinds of regularities that are important in reading. So if we think about English spelling has two forms of regular patterns that are very important for children to come to appreciate. So the first is one that we talk about a lot, which are spelling sound regularities. So the idea is that if you learn these sorts of words, you might come to the appreciation that the letter A has an A sound. So those are spelling sound regularities. And there are also spelling meaning regularities. But if you were here last year, I talked about those. And these are largely morphological regularities. So if we look at these words, children might come to appreciate the idea that this regular pattern here, ER, does something to make the words agentive. It's an agent type of meaning. And as we know, there has been really persistent and intense debate over how best to communicate these sorts of regularities when children are learning to read. So we have synthetic phonics approaches which present these regularities explicitly, and then that structures the learning. There's inquiry-based approaches where people say, well, it's better if they discover the regularities on their own, and of course whole language approaches. And I think that this debate, you can really see this in some of the pedagogical literature and in the media reporting of how children learn to read. So here's just a couple of examples. This quote here, I think, typifies the idea that this idea of discovery learning is a central pillar of constructivism. So the idea is knowledge students construct on their own is more valuable than knowledge modeled for them, told to them, or shown, demonstrated, or explained to them by a teacher. So in some way, the thinking is that if you've discovered the knowledge on your own, that will lead to more robust knowledge. And that permeates a lot of the discussion about how children should learn to read. And here's a more popular example by Michael Rosen, who's a very popular commentator on how people learn to read. So he talks about sitting with our children, reading books, talking, pointing at whole words, sometimes at letters. We write shopping lists. We label things in their room. We plan holidays. We've been doing this for centuries. And so the idea is that you can somehow extract these important regularities by being in a literacy-rich environment. And of course, that's the whole premise of whole language that dominated our thinking about reading through the 1980s. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present to you some work that we're doing with adults to look at, well, how good are people at learning these sorts of regularities? And the way that we do this is by creating artificial languages. And we bring adults into the lab over a period of days or weeks and get them to learn new vocabularies printed in completely novel scripts. So although they have a background in reading, they will never have seen these scripts before. And so the way that they approach this task can tell us something about the mechanisms or the capabilities that adults have to extract these sorts of regularities. And we think that we can apply these insights to children. I should say that in these studies, we're using largely raw hallway undergraduates. So these are students, they don't have any literacy or language impairments that we know of. They're all native English speakers. Students here are high achieving, they're highly intelligent, and so we are looking at a collection of population that may be more at the more able end of the distribution. And I think you should keep that in mind when I show you the data. So this is what we do to look at learning. So we bring people into the lab, and on day one, we give them a spoken vocabulary. And so you can see here, this is a new language that they're getting. They might learn that bav means cherries, fig is broccoli. And at the moment, they don't know that these are two different languages. They're told that they're going to learn two different languages. But at this stage, on day one, the only difference between these is the vowels that are used. This language uses a different set of vowels than this one. And on the second day, we start to introduce the written language. Let me show you what the written language looks like. So the written languages look like this, and these are actually scripts that have fallen out of use. They were actual scripts, although they didn't map to the same phonemes. So all that we've done here is we've taken these existing out-of-use scripts and we've mapped them in a one-to-one way to the spoken language. So what you can see here is, that's the symbol for B, and you can see it again here, right? So it's completely one-to-one. This language is exactly the same. It's one-to-one against those phonemes, but it's obviously got different symbols. The symbols look very different. And when we train people on these languages, we keep them blocked so they can't become confused about which language that they're learning. Now, the slightly tricky thing about these languages is that we've added a final silent character. So we have silent letters a lot in English and in other languages. But the trick is that in this language, that silent last letter cues the meaning, right? So it cues the category. This means fruits and vegetables, this one is about animals, this one's about vehicles, and this one's about tools. But in this language, that silent last character is just random. It's just silent, and they should learn to ignore it. Now, we don't tell people about how these writing systems work, at least in the first experiment here. All we're doing is asking them to learn these 48 words, 24 in each script, over a period of 2 weeks. So they're coming in every day for two hours a day to learn these 48 novel words. And the question is, what can they extract about how these writing systems work, right? So it's as if, imagine that you're teaching a child to read using something like whole language, and they're just extracting these regular patterns. Now, there is no ambiguity within each of these scripts, although the tricky bit, the bit of irregularity, is that final letter in the scripts functions differently. So the question is, how much can our high-achieving, high-intelligent adult readers get out of this after about 20 hours of training on these scripts? And when we set out to do this, I thought, well, obviously they're gonna have no problem learning this. I'll show you the data in just a minute. So what we do is on every day, between 90 minutes and 120 minutes, they're in the lab. They're focusing on reading aloud these. They get feedback on every trial. They learn to say the meanings, so they're learning to associate those symbols with a meaning. They do different kinds of picture word tasks, so they'll get the picture and be asked to select which word it is and the opposite. And then we give them certain kinds of meaningful tasks, like we might say, okay, this word has black and white stripes and hooves, and then we give them a selection of words to choose from, and they have to choose the right one. So we're drilling them on the sounds and the meanings of these words every day, up to 2 hours a day, for 2 weeks. And then on day 10, we have a series of tasks. Some of the tasks assess their knowledge of the individual words that they've learned. So we'll have them read aloud, we'll have them say the meanings of those written words. Recognition memory is just saying whether they've seen the word or not seen the word. We test their oral language. Now, in the actual experiment, we don't talk about oral language except for on the first day. We don't then go back to it over time. And we just want to see what's happened to their oral language knowledge as they've learned to read. Now, the tasks that we're most interested in are these generalization tasks in red. And these assess how much they've picked up about the spelling to sound regular patterns, the way that characters map to sounds, and the spelling to meaning regular pattern, so what that final letter does in the systematic language. In addition, we have a lot of data on these individuals, so we have data about their word and non-word reading performance, how well the spellers they are, their vocabulary, phonological awareness. And remember, because we are dealing with a very high-achieving sample, there's not that much variability in these measures, but there is still some variability. Right, so now I'm going to show you the data. These lines here, there's 2 lines right on top of each other. These refer to the 2 languages, the systematic language where that final character means something, and the unsystematic language where it doesn't. And you can see these are nice learning curves, as you might expect, over 10 days of learning. And remember, this is just their reading aloud of the 48 items that they're being asked to learn. So that's not too surprising. But when you break this down into individual subjects, I'm going to show you the 24 individual subjects now, what you can see is a great deal of variability. So it turns out that by about day 3, after 6 hours of training, most of our subjects can get to about 80% correct. But there's still, a quarter of the sample is still really struggling, even after 20 hours of training on these words. If I show you the data on learning to say the meaning of the word, so this is just learning how to associate those visual forms with meanings. Oops. The data, I'm going to come back to this slide, the data look very similar. And I think this is not too surprising, actually, because humans are very, very bad at this sort of learning. This is basically just associating visual symbols with a meaning, which is what reading is all about. So there's a lot of variability. Now going back to the reading aloud data, these data are very important because they end up predicting how well people can appreciate those spelling to sound regularities. So if we look here on this graph, here plotted are each individual subject's performance at the end of that training on reading aloud the trained items, the 48 items that they've been taught to learn. This is their non-word reading performance. So this is the test of how well that they can extract those spelling sound regularities. And you can see the same sort of variability in that test. And it turns out that this almost entirely predicts this. So you can see that those that were bad on this task are also bad on this task. What's more surprising, perhaps, is that even in this high-achieving sample, people's ability to extract these regular patterns, the spelling sound patterns, was almost completely driven by their vocabulary and their phonological awareness. Right? So even in the little bit of variability we have in our adult sample in oral language and phonological measures, that's still driving their learning performance of these novel scripts to a very large degree. So we can imagine if we thought about that in children, when we have much greater variability, we can probably think about what kind of regularities those children might be extracting. Oh, I've already shown this graph. This is the say and the meaning graph, where people are very variable in learning the meanings of these words, even after 20 hours of training. And if we look at, this is the semantic generalization. So this is the test of how many of them appreciated what that last letter does. And we're just looking at the language where the last letter is meaningful here. So on this test, it was a choice of 1 out of 4. So if they just guessed on every trial, they would be 25% correct. So that's what we call chance performance. So we can see that only about half the sample has discovered those regularities. The rest are just guessing. Right? And we were pretty stunned about this. So only half of those adults, after all that training, have managed to extract what that last letter is doing. Interestingly, those who captured the regularity, those up here, tended to fail to capture the spelling sound regularities. So these things traded against each other. If you did well on the spelling sound regularity, if you discovered those first 3 letters were about mapping to sound, then they did really, really poorly on getting that last letter. If they got the last letter, they did poorly on the spelling to sound. Only a quarter of our adults managed to fully appreciate how those writing systems were working. Remember, we gave them no direct instruction on how the writing systems worked. We just told them to learn those 48 words, and we imagined that they would be able to extract the regular patterns given to them. But they didn't. Only a quarter of the sample was able to do that. When we debriefed them at the end, we asked, did you discover anything about the writing systems? How did you do the tasks? Did you discover any patterns? Some of the participants did show some awareness of how the writing systems worked, right? So, and sometimes that awareness was partial. So this person discovered the first 3 letters were meaningful, but they decided to ignore the 4th letter, right? So they got part of it. This person found that the last symbol was the meaningful symbol, and they also discovered the other bits. But some of the subjects really had no idea at the end of all this training. So this guy says no rule or pattern there. This person decided to read the words from right to left, which was an interesting innovation. Sometimes, so this person noted that the last letter sometimes cued the meaning, but they didn't really get. They said, okay, well, canoe, tricycle, squirrel, and tomato all have the same symbol, right? So that's not a regular pattern. That's just kind of trying to do their best to group these words. So you can see that there's a lot of individual variability on people coming to appreciate how these very simple writing systems worked. So what do we know? Even in our skilled adult sample, there's huge variability in people's ability to discover the regular patterns in a writing system, even after very extensive training. And we were surprised that our adults, none of which reported any kind of language or literacy impairment, were very, very poor indeed. We were surprised that even in our adult sample, with such little variability in the underlying measures, their discovery of these regular patterns is still being driven by their underlying oral language ability, which of course is also what we see in children and links to Jessie's talk. We see that only a quarter of our sample fully cracked these writing systems. Some subjects captured one form of regularity at the expense of another. And I think it implies that if we try to ask children to extract regularities from a body of knowledge like this, well, perhaps some would do that, but many might not without explicit instruction. And what this prompted us to do then was to take the same task and say, well, what happens if we give people just a little bit of explicit instruction? How does that change the picture? So we did a second study, and the only difference with this study is that we removed the first day of written language training. And instead of that 2 hours of written language training on day 2, we just did a very short session, including a PowerPoint presentation, where we explained the structure of each alphabet, how they worked. We did a little spelling to sound task. So we presented each visual symbol with its accompanying sound and had people repeat that. So that's a little bit of phonics there at the very start. And then we did a spelling to meaning task. So we presented that last symbol in the systematic language and had people say what the category was after we told them how these writing systems worked. And this took about 30 minutes. So we're just giving just a fraction of direct instruction. Okay, so that's our discovery group that I've already presented that gets to about 80% correct. If I now reveal how the direct instruction group does, and this is reading aloud. This is just reading aloud the individual items, right? So nothing about regularities yet. And here they are. So every subject basically at ceiling on learning these individual vocabulary items, following just a tiny bit of explicit instruction. If we look at generalization now, so how well do they do at capturing the spelling sound regularities? Here's our discovery learners, which gets to about 80% correct. Those that have been given that little bit of explicit instruction at the start are almost perfect. And if we look at the spelling meaning generalization, so this is whether they've appreciated what that last character does and can apply that to novel words. What we see for our discovery group, only half of them got that. For the ones that have had explicit instruction, 100% of them get it 100% of the time. And if we look at oral language, this is very fascinating because remember, we didn't train oral language except for on the very first day. So then they go 9 days without any oral language training. And we come back on day 10 to say, well, what do they still know about the spoken language? And this is equivalent to vocabulary. So we're looking at how much does the reading training impact on their vocabulary. It turns out that both groups do improve, but you can see that there's a vast difference between the discovery learners and the explicit instruction learners. So here we have again, they can only remember about 80% of the spoken language items, that's their vocabulary in the new language, where these guys are again almost perfect. And we can see how this happens by considering the reading system here. So if people know how letters map to sounds, and if they know that through this phonics instruction, then every time we're asking people to map letters to the meanings, they can go this route. And that strengthens this mapping between sounds and meanings on every single trial. So in a way, this training on a written language, particularly after direct instruction, phonics instruction, helps them to improve their vocabularies. And that resounds with a lot of evidence that we know about child learners, in that learning to read actually provides a reciprocal benefit for their oral language. Okay, so what do we know about explicit instruction? We think that what's going on here is that the explicit instruction, even though it's just a tiny bit in this very simple writing system, it structures the future learning. So it tells our participants what to look for. So they're not using all their working memory to try to figure out this puzzle. They already know it, and they can structure their learning. It helps them to learn the individual vocabulary items, and then it helps them also to extract the regular patterns. And what we were so surprised by was that these explicit learners, they were basically at ceiling from the start. And those in the discovery learning condition, even after all that training, just never caught up. And I think the most important part of this work is that what we've seen is that people's underlying ability in the discovery learning group really determines how well they learn these writing systems. When we give explicit instruction, that wipes those underlying differences away, right? It manages to bring all of our learners up to the same level, irrespective of what their underlying vocabulary or phonological skills look like. Right? And I think that that's very important if we think about pupil diversity and students with special educational needs in particular. Right? So if we give that explicit instruction, that's just wiping away those underlying difficulties. And we were very surprised by the fact that this explicit instruction also transferred to spoken language learning. And I think that that's possibly going to happen with children as well. So I think that what these results would say is that they give strong support to the idea that we should use explicit instruction when pupils are charged with capturing underlying regularities in any kind of body of knowledge, but particularly in something like literacy, which doesn't require a critical period. And that's all I have today, so I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, we've got some time for questions, about 5 minutes. Does anyone have a question for Kathy? Yeah?
So in that training, second training division, you train the students on both the sound meaning and the letter meaning and the letter sound. There was no, you didn't do two conditions where you trained.
Yeah, the training is identical to the first experiment. So all we're doing is removing one day of the training to give the direct instruction. And then all the rest of the training is exactly the same for the next 9 days. But you can see that, I didn't put up the graph for the saying the meaning, but it's exactly the same. People are at ceiling from the start. Exactly. So you can see in this one that there's just 1 day less of the training. And that's just because we've removed the first day of the written language training. But their knowledge of the meanings is the same. Right? It's at ceiling.
Yeah. Would you compare those two conditions, or would you? I'm thinking of how it applies to English, for example, other languages that have both these combinations of mappings. Does it mean that we should really teach both these aspects, both these mappings?
I think that this is obviously a laboratory experiment, but my view is that, and the literature suggests humans are very bad at what we call paired associate learning. So that's just mapping one set of stimuli to another that doesn't have any systematicity. And in English, if we're looking at monomorphemic words, there is no relationship between letters and meanings. Right? The only systematicity is between letters and sounds. And that's why phonics, in combination with strong oral language, is so important at getting students off the ground, right? So if and we have a paper that we've just published on this, and I've just seen an article in Sen magazine on it today. But if you're wasting time trying to do that paired associate mapping, it's almost like Chinese. If you're trying to take visual symbols and map them to a random meaning, that's taking away from time that you could be spending on this phonic training, right? So the only reason that we did all of this meaning instruction here is because people have said, well, the meanings are very important, and we basically wanted to show that we had given this meaning training. But in real life, it's the phonic training that really gets people off the ground. And in the case of this sort of model, if you're doing this and they have strong oral language, this is basically the simple view of reading, right? If you train decoding, they can map it to their oral language and they can get to the meaning. And it's this constant pairing then over time of letters and meanings via sound that enables people to form this direct connection. But we know in the brain literature that happens much, much later. That's happening into adolescence after many, many years of reading instruction.
Do those principles apply in the same way to spelling as to reading?
English, don't get me started on English spelling. So English spelling is mostly constrained by the spelling sound mapping, right? But it's much more inconsistent in spelling than it is in reading, because there's many possible ways to spell something. This mapping is incredibly important for spelling. We know that morphological knowledge can also help with your spelling. So there's a lot of cases, for example, where my favorite example is OUS, to spell us. If you spell us with OUS, that can only be an adjective. And there's many rules like this that actually many teachers don't know. But there's certain letter streams that are actually reserved for certain grammatical classes. We think we must write these down one day to help with English spelling. But I think those are just regularities on top of the really important spelling sound regularities.
Kathy, don't you follow Michael Rose?
What? I have an ongoing Twitter issue with Michael Rosen, and every so often, I mean, this guy, I was on word of mouth with him, and he's very smart, and I thought, oh, this is going to be terrible because we're going to get into a debate about phonics or something. But he was very good host. But every so often we get into some form of Twitter debate. And I can't believe this guy. I mean, he's always on Twitter. I mean, he comes back, within seconds. And I don't know how he gets so much done, actually. But he is wrong about reading, reading it's not about ideology. Reading is a simple problem that the brain has to solve. And human learning has certain principles that govern it. And we need to apply those to help people learn to read.
It's a very powerful message, isn't it? Explicit instruction levels up. That's what I'm taking from what you're saying. What intrigues me rather is how we apply this to sin. There's a lot of work going on, as you know, about response to instruction at the moment. But I'm not seeing much fruit coming from that as to how we build this solidity into intervention programs, of which there are many. I'm sure various.
Well, I think I have to leave the details of that to people who actually know how to teach children and what works. I think my main point here is that still we're hearing a lot in the media and in blogs and from unions about how explicit instruction is damaging to children, and it's rote learning and it's teaching to the test. But actually, it is a fundamental principle of learning that explicit instruction structures your future learning. And we want to explore this in more detail over the next few years. But I think that's the central message. And I think it can be applied widely, whether in reading or discovering regularities in other domains.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kathy. A lot of food for thought for how we take this forward. And there'll be a workshop this afternoon on reading for people to share their ideas. We've got about a 15-minute break for coffee, so quite brief. Please grab a coffee and come back in. And let's thank Kathy once again for a really interesting
Put up a different Twitter.
Oh, I know. I noticed. I realised in your slides because I was just tweeting stuff and I was like, oh, it's.
I've changed it.
Oh, okay, great.
And I wrote it there.
Oh, good. Okay, cool. So
I will.
I literally just used the same one from last year.
Yes, but then actually it ended up being more obvious last year. I think
Maybe it was an old version.
yeah, no, the same thing happened last year. No, but the same thing happened last year with there being 2 ones.
The estate that we went to, the place that we went to. Oh, what? The pop-up? Yeah. Yeah. Well, it was exempted Hordle. In where? Hordle. Yeah. So then did you stay in the meeting afterwards? Yes. Yeah. It was Googling stuff. Yeah, but I had to time between them. That was good to me. Yeah, good sense. You know what? I think you should tell me is it big enough for you to live in? Yeah, because they never get something huge. There's so much stuff. It's to coast the country.
Other rooms have it so that we're on panels. Yeah, I know. Sort of so good.
I'm not worried about whether it is
but yes, I think everybody did manage to get something to drink. So we're going to kick off now for our session on mental health. And our first speaker in this session is Dr. Helen Pote, who you've already met this morning. So thank you very much, Helen.
Hello, thank you very much. Very pleased to speak to you and to just chatting in the break to people who came last year. So I'm very pleased to see you back again. So today I'm going to talk about really health promotion, well-being approaches, positive approaches to mental health in school settings. And I'll come on to why I've chosen that focus. I'm not going to present huge amounts of data actually. What I'm presenting here is a review of the meta-analyses and literature that I've been doing in preparation for a British Psychological Society publication which will come out in the autumn, a commissioned review. So I hope that you will take the main messages from that review, and we will put it on the website, so the CERN's website, from September. Okay, so don't worry about scribbling down any references, all of the information will be on there. So why is the mental health of young people important? You'll know that I said last year I think it's important for several reasons. It's very common for young people in school settings to be showing signs of mental health distress, and in fact 1 in 10 children will have a diagnosable mental health difficulty. So that's 3 children in every classroom will have a diagnosable level of mental health difficulty, with lots of other kids having levels of stress and distress that don't reach diagnosable levels, but that you're dealing with as teachers. Secondly, it's a costly problem. It's really costly to us in terms of not only the cost to the individual child in terms of their outcomes, in terms of school attainment, high likelihood of exclusions, other negative impacts on their life as they move towards adolescence, including more likelihood of pregnancy, prison sentences, etc. But it's actually costly in money terms, costing us 34 billion a year, and the government have agreed to put another 1.4 billion in over the next 3 years for that, so increasing costs. And the other reason it's important is that we know getting children early can be helpful, because most 50% of mental health problems will start by age 14, and we have interventions that work for those young people, both targeted to those young people and more universal interventions that can be delivered in schools. So we need to be identifying these problems early, treating them early. And unfortunately, as you'll know, that's not the picture that we see of CAMHS services. So only a quarter of children who are diagnosed with a mental health difficulty will actually get to see a specialist mental health practitioner. So that means the other 75% are with you in school, with behavioural difficulties, emotional difficulties that you're trying to contain and work with in order that you can maximise their learning. So I'm going to talk a bit about a health promotion approach to supporting the well-being and mental health of all our young people in schools. And this is what's termed in the international literature mental health literacy, or sometimes mental health first aid, you'll know is the government's popular term at the moment. It comprises of 4 key aspects: that there's a universal promotion of well-being, that attitudes and stigma towards mental health are reduced, that there's a recognition of individuals in society of what constitutes mental health problems, what are mental health problems, what do they look like, so that they recognise them. And people have enough knowledge about mental health problems that they would know what to do in the first instance in responding. And that's why it links very well to the mental health first aid idea, is that we all know if we see a child with a graze on their knee, what we'd need to assess, what we'd need to do, and what sticking plaster we'd need to put on. But if we see a child displaying symptoms of anxiety, for example, we don't always all know what's the best first response to that. This concept of mental health literacy has been less well researched in school settings. Mental health first aid has been less well researched in school settings. It's been less well researched with young people in general. But internationally, with adults, there have been huge amounts of interventions, and I'm talking about large-scale population-based interventions across America, Canada, and Australia, particularly, to skill up the general public in terms of their mental health knowledge, their skills in well-being promotion, and addressing mental health stigma. So why is this idea important to schools? Well, you'll have seen in the press lots of information about the government's response to what's called the 5-year forward view for mental health, which was a survey of what the mental health needs of young people, and a review of the service provision in this area. And the government this year has produced its response, what it's going to do about that. And if you look at the things that it says it's going to do about that over the next 3 years, 4 of the things focus on schools. So 4 of the things that government think they're going to do to address mental health problems are focused on interventions in schools. So that's mental health first aid training, having at least 1 teacher in every secondary school by 2019, looking at prevention and well-being approaches in schools and evaluating what works most effectively, having peer support and peer mentoring programs in schools and online, and they've kept in there as well the possibility of some joint inspections by the Care Quality Commission, who inspect health provision, and Ofsted to look at children's mental health and well-being in schools. So the targets are coming, is the issue. And I think a lot of schools are feeling, well, we don't have the resource to be addressing mental health needs in schools, and sometimes we don't know what we need to be doing in schools. So the rest of my talk is really going to focus on 4 key messages from the literature about mental health promotion, well-being interventions that we know can enhance any interventions that you might decide to deliver in schools. Although the government is saying they're giving 1.4 billion, it's notable that last week in the Times Educational Supplement that there was a big launch, and Theresa May was up there talking about mental health first aiders in every secondary school, and the money that was actually released was £2,000 to train 3,000 teachers as the first as mental health first aiders in schools. Okay, delivered by a company called Mental Health First Aid. And this is not the only approach you need to take. And so I'm just emphasising to you that you will already be doing a lot about mental health promotion in schools, about wellbeing interventions in schools that meets this government agenda. It isn't all about this sort of mental health first aid, having 1 first aider in schools. So I'm you know, a lot of it is rhetoric and relabelling of things that you already will be doing. So what's the problem that we're trying to solve when we're talking about mental health promotion and mental health first aid? Well, think about a child in your school. A child a teacher told me about recently was Seema coming to her with stomach aches. Okay, so she comes and she says, I've got terrible stomach aches, I've been off school yesterday, and can I get out this lesson now? Because I just can't concentrate, the pain is so bad. She's a teenager. We're not sure whether it's sort of puberty related, but we let her out the lesson, and this becomes a repeated pattern. She reports she's not eating regularly because of it, and she's clearly losing weight. And she's not sleeping or waking, and she's waking up very early. Okay, so let's think about 2 different school responses to that. In school A, who might have a good whole school approach to mental health and well-being, with support for teachers around this and high levels of mental health literacy, Seema might not be too concerned about discussing the issues she has with her peers. There might not be a lot of stigma around in that for her. She might even take the step of talking to a teacher about this. And we would hope that the teacher would be able to recognise that some of the description that she's presenting there may well be symptoms of anxiety. Okay? And that teacher would have enough skills, because of the support and training they'd received in schools, to begin to talk with Seema about some of the risk and resilience factors that were around for her in her life at the moment. And if they did that, which this teacher did, talk to Seema a little bit more, they'd understand that she'd had a recent bereavement in the family, which was causing her quite a lot of distress, and that was a risk factor for her own mental health. And that she was also facing upcoming exams, which she was very anxious about. Okay? So the teacher could then understand and formulate and identify that these might not be physical health problems, but they might be part of an underlying stress or mental health difficulty. And if they were really well trained and mental health literacy, mental health promotion was embedded within the school, they might even be able to screen that young person very early on for those difficulties using a validated mental health measure. I'll come on to discuss a few. And then they'd be able to direct Seema to appropriate resources, either within the school, online, or within the local community. And they'd be seeking to follow her up within their pastoral care system. Okay? So in a school that's well functioning with high levels of mental health literacy, that's what we'd expect to see. But if we turn to school B with the opposite of that, we might see Seema unsure whether she can talk to her peers about these issues for fear of stigma, unsure whether she can talk to her teachers, but if she does, the teacher themselves may not know how to respond to those difficulties, may be unsure of what questions to ask to elicit risk and resilience factors, unsure whether these concerns really form part of a mental health difficulty or physical problem, and unsure what available help there might be to offer Seema anyway. And you can see that that would quite easily lead to them to reassure Seema and send her off to the GP for a physical investigation, missing the opportunity for some early health promotion, early intervention. And it's not just the teachers that need that. Seema herself, if she was in a good school that was promoting mental health and well-being, would be able to recognise some of those symptoms for herself early on. Okay, and know there was something that she needed to address. So that's what we're really trying to tackle in mental health promotion, mental health literacy. The promotion of well-being, addressing some of those attitudes to stigma and mental health in schools, enabling pupils and staff to recognise mental health problems, and to have enough knowledge about mental health problems and well-being that they can either direct young people to appropriate services or deliver some well-being interventions themselves. Okay. And we know that internationally from the adult surveys that if you improve mental health literacy, this has positive effects on mental health outcomes. It's in terms of there being lower levels of anxiety and depression because it's recognised much earlier and addressed much earlier. There's also lower levels of mental health stigma and more help-seeking behaviour. Okay, so more young people and adults coming forward to seek help about mental health problems. So it is important in our longer term outcomes. So what we're talking about here is universal, sometimes it's termed this language in the literature, universal, that means delivered to all staff and pupils, mental health literacy training and wellbeing interventions at the level of promotion. Although some of this goes down into the level of prevention, where we're trying to prevent some of these problems happening. But just a little aside, for mental health interventions to be effective, we need to address all of these three levels: promotion, prevention and treatment of the targeted pupils. And what happens, in fact, when you look at the meta-analyses and all the individual studies, is that promotion is the least effective in addressing pupil mental health outcomes. So the effect sizes, the effect of those interventions are quite small. But when we start to look at those delivering interventions to those children who are at risk of mental health problems, the effect sizes start increasing. And when we get to those children who are definitely diagnosed with mental health problems and are delivered interventions by specialist services, the effect sizes are at their largest. So what the government isn't quite appreciating, but just addressing promotion as one of its main ideas, we cannot forget prevention and treatment, and this should not all be on schools. You know, however much you do about promotion, mental health promotion, it's not going to address all of those mental health needs that are out there. So what can improve your mental health promotion and wellbeing interventions in schools? There are 4 things that you can do. Okay. And the literature shows this quite clearly. There are over 1,000 studies spanning 20 years. And the literature consistently shows that a whole school approach to mental health and well-being is what works. So that means that just picking particular bits of interventions without embedding it in really the leadership and management of the school and the ethos of the school has been shown consistently in previous studies to fail. Okay, so I'll come on to talk about one spectacular example of that. But the sorts of things that Public Health England and indeed NICE are recommending in relation to a whole school approach is that at the centre, the leadership and management of the school focuses on integrating mental health and mental health promotion at the heart of everything that the school does. And that there are particular champions within that. So someone who's identified as a mental health champion within the school is usually useful. That leadership and management structure will promote an ethos, an environment that provokes respect and values diversity in terms of people's mental health, response to stress, etc. That the curriculum, teaching and learning are used to promote resilience and support social and emotional learning. And that's not just in your PHSE lessons, but across all aspects of the curriculum. That students are involved, that there's a big student voice and participation in the development of mental health, well-being, promotion interventions in schools. Because that enhances those issues around stigma and attitudes towards mental health, bullying around mental health get fully addressed. Keys that staff are developed to support their own well-being as well as that of students. So the NUT surveys say 81% of staff, school staff, are reporting high levels of stress, high levels of anxiety and depression. And unless we think about addressing those, school staff are really taking on board their own mental health needs and learning how to address those, then they can't really effectively teach that to young people. That we need to identify need and monitor impact of interventions. I'll come back to that in a minute. And that whole school approaches which have involved parents and carers are likely or have been shown to be more successful than those that just stay within the school limits. And that there needs to be access to targeted support and appropriate referral. So you need to be getting your CAM services liaising with you about what you're developing in the schools, or your EPs. Okay. So an example of a whole school approach not working, do you remember the SEAL programme? What do people think of the SEAL programme? Okay, a few shaking heads. So this was an approach, supposedly a whole school approach, which was rolled out in over 90% of secondary schools and 70% of primary schools across the UK. Actually, when they looked at the impact of this for evaluating it over 3 years for over almost 9,000 students from year 7 going up to year 10, There's no development in their social emotional skills, no development in their mental health difficulties, although those, no improvement, although those two did nearly reach significance. There was no improvement in pro-social behaviour problems, some aspects of the school climate, including trust, supportiveness and liking at school, reduced. And the effects didn't last beyond the length of the intervention. Okay? So this was a really good example of a patchy implementation of a whole school approach where schools took actually just selective bits of modules of the SEAL learning and tried to implement those in quite a patchy way over time, and sustaining their interest and involvement because they could see things weren't working particularly well was difficult. The second thing that works well is if interventions are slightly more targeted and based on the needs of your school. Now, it still surprises me that schools do not monitor routinely the mental health and well-being needs of their school group. Do any schools do that, routinely screen their young people? A couple of people. I'd be really interested to hear what you're doing because there's so many standardised and fantastic tools out there at the moment of mental health and well-being. Here's just one example. All of these are available freely on the Cork website, cork.org.uk. corc.org.uk. This is the Me and My Feelings measure. Okay, standardised across the UK, takes 10 minutes for pupils to fill in and gives you a snapshot of the mental health needs in your schools so that you can target interventions. And we know that will improve the effectiveness of your interventions from small impact to medium-sized statistical impact. Okay, the third thing that works is a focus on regular active skills development. So really thinking about not just teaching young people about mental health, but getting it to connect to their values, what they're actually trying to, the difficult life situations they're actually facing there and then, and getting them to problem solve around that. Often this is called resilience training in schools, and we know from the UK Resilience project that's been evaluated over the last 10 years, here the review in 2011 by over 2,000 pupils, it's a manualised programme of resilience training. It's delivered by teachers and it's got a controlled comparison. We know that it improves depression symptom scores, school attendance rates and academic attainment in English. And those last two things are really important. So we're not just talking here about mental health and resilience interventions to improve mental health, we're talking about improving your school attainment. Anxiety, behaviour, maths and life satisfaction with less impact, but what they did find that was interesting was that weekly workshops, very regular weekly interventions are what works for young people. And again, the at-risk people, this is at risk of mental health problems, at-risk pupils that were identified showed much more improvements than the other young people, and the improvements lasted younger. And this was a university delivered approach, so it didn't section those young people off. It delivered it to everyone, but they had the most improvement from it. The fourth and final thing that works is training school staff effectively in the 4 aspects of mental health literacy. To recognise signs of mental health problems, understand child development and attachment, knowledge of mental health problems and refer appropriately. And I'm running out of time, so in the slide that I put up, on the website, I've given links to resources that have been shown to be evidence-based in each of those areas that I hope you can draw on. But the final thing I wanted to say was about making sure that when you're training school staff effectively to understand those things, you're also teaching them about managing their own stress and well-being in order that they can deliver those interventions to young people. And it's important to say, though, we shouldn't always rely on school staff to be delivering interventions. The outcome studies are really split on this. So teacher-delivered interventions, for half of the studies, showed an improvement, showed them, good improvement. But for the other half of the studies, the only improvements were when it was mental health professionals delivering training. Okay? So we shouldn't always rely on teachers to be delivering all of this. It should be a collaboration really between mental health staff and teachers. I've got 30 seconds left. So I will just highlight to you how successfully this approach was taken across Surrey, who delivered mental health literacy training for over 2,500 members of staff, and we evaluated the programme here at Royal Holloway. I evaluated that, and there was statistically significant increases in all of staff's areas of competence in terms of mental health literacy. And that was delivered through quite short training sessions, but actually what was really important was following that up with consultations into the schools so that that learning could be sustained. I won't tell you about mindfulness because I haven't got time, but just to conclude, changes in pupil outcomes as a result of universal approaches usually have small effect sizes, but we know they have real life impacts for young people. To maximise the effectiveness of these approaches in your school, you need to take a whole school approach, design interventions based on need, implement them thoroughly over time. Fidelity to the models was important, and teach staff and pupils actively mental health skills in small groups. And I would encourage you to use the resources that are out there in terms of defining needs beforehand to evaluate your outcomes at the end of any interventions you develop. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. Do you have any questions for Helen?
There's quite a lot of publicity just over the last couple of months about mindfulness in schools, and there really not being a lot of evidence to back it up. How do you feel about that?
I am not a huge mindfulness fan. Okay, I have to put that on the table. The evidence that is out there is developed and promoted by huge mindfulness fans. So you have to be careful about that. Also, my experience is that the evidence that is out there, and there have been over 50 studies in schools actually, is that there is a moderate effect in terms of the relaxation skills that students have, effect on their physiology, etc. However, that is delivered by people who are specialist mindfulness practitioners. And I think what's been happening in schools is that people have sort of liked the idea of mindfulness, been trying to teach that to young people without it being actually integrated into either their own practice in mindfulness or regular practice for the children in mindfulness. And the studies that have shown effective outcomes for mindfulness have been taught by specialists and have involved regular mindfulness meditation, really regularly 3 or 4 times a week. And I don't think that's how it's being delivered in schools, so we can't really assume that the effectiveness will be the same.
I think we've got time for another one, if there's another question. Well, we will make sure that Helen's slides are on the website so that you can peruse those later. Hopefully they'll have some useful tips in there for you. And we'll look forward to seeing Helen's report for the BPS. Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, well, Kat's finding her slides. I will just introduce Dr. Kat Sebastian, who is a reader, newly appointed reader in the Department of Psychology, working with us. And Kat's going to be talking about reactive aggression and emotion regulation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jessie. A bit of a change of pace from Helen's talk, which gave a fantastic overview of mental health in schools. I'm looking at adolescent mental health from a slightly different perspective, more of an experimental perspective. And so I'm just going to present the results of one study that we've done, again, as part of an ESRC funded project on emotion regulation development during adolescence. And in particular, I'm going to focus on this idea of reactive aggression, and in reference to a type of emotion regulation known as temporal distancing, otherwise known as mental time travel, or the idea of thinking something like, this too shall pass. And I'll talk about whether this is an effective means of regulating emotions during the teenage years, and whether kids who show high levels of reactive aggression benefit from this sort of strategy. So first of all, what is reactive aggression, and why is it interesting to those of us studying child development? So reactive aggression is very common in all of us. So it's aggression in response to threats, frustrations and provocations. So a typical item on a questionnaire looking at reactive aggression in teenagers, for example, might be damage things because you felt mad. You know, so that feeling of, I'm really irritated, so I'm going to bash the keyboard. So hugely common in all of us, but it's particularly common during adolescence and actually peaks during the mid-adolescent years. Worth noting that aggression is a very kind of multi-dimensional construct, and reactive aggression differs from proactive aggression, which is aggression in pursuit of a goal, for example, to show who was on top or to gain something materially. And they're actually really quite different forms of aggression with different causes. Now, reactive aggression is much more common than proactive aggression, both in the general population at large and also in a group of children that I've studied in the past, those children with clinically significant levels of conduct problems or antisocial behaviour. So it's really important to try and understand what works and what doesn't work in this group. I'm interested in particular in how young people learn to regulate or manage their emotions, and so reactive aggression is particularly of interest to me because almost by definition reactive aggression reflects a failure of emotional control. Emotion regulation, of course, interesting and important to understand and define this. Emotion regulation, broadly speaking, refers to monitoring, evaluating and modifying our emotional reactions in order to accomplish a goal. And there are various different types of emotion regulation, but what this particular study focuses on is a deliberate attempt to modulate our emotion. So in everyday life, there'll be lots of emotionally evocative things going on. Actually, a lot of the emotion regulation that we do in everyday life is implicit. So, for example, you're not affected by every sort of sad or anxious face that you see. You kind of filter out a lot of the emotionally evocative stimuli in your environment so that you can carry on and attain your goals. However, a really important aspect of emotional control is the conscious and deliberate attempt to use strategies to try and manage our emotions. And one of the most widely researched is known as cognitive reappraisal. So that's changing one's interpretation of an event. So for example, if a child found out they got a bad mark on their homework, if you were successful at cognitive reappraisal, you might bring to bear a whole host of explicit and deliberate strategies to try and make yourself feel better. So you might think, I'll do better next time, or use a distancing strategy such as, it won't matter long term. So what are the links between adolescence, emotion regulation and mental health? Adolescence, I mainly study the sort of secondary age range, is a period of physical, psychological and social transition between childhood and adulthood. And I quite like this definition because it really encapsulates the breadth of the change that's going on for an adolescent during this time of life. And as Helen was saying, it's a key time for the onset of mental ill health, such as depression, anxiety and conduct disorder. And I think one of the things that links a lot of these difficulties is poor emotion regulation. Reactive aggression, as I was saying, peaks during the adolescent years, and so I'm interested in particular in this age group to see if we can understand more about how adolescents learn to regulate their emotions, and possibly how this might feed into understanding mental illness at this time of life. So what do we know about emotion regulation development during adolescence? So focusing on explicit development, we know, for example, that some experimental studies have found that the ability to use these reappraisal strategies does improve during adolescence. So for example, this study gave people pictures to look at, individuals between, I think, age 10 and 22 in this sample, and some of these pictures were just neutral, boring pictures. Others were emotionally evocative, such as seeing a snake or seeing a person crying. And in this study, they used a form of distancing where called spatial distancing. So the participants had to either imagine themselves standing close to what was in the picture or standing far away. The idea being that by using this sort of distancing strategy, you can reduce the emotional distress that you feel when you're looking at a picture like this. And this study did find some modest improvement over the course of adolescence in the ability to reduce self-reported distress using this sort of strategy, with a plateau in late adolescence. But not all studies have shown these effects. There seems to be a difference between, for example, if you're asking someone to do this explicitly in a lab, and whether you're asking people whether they use these sorts of strategies in everyday life. So yes, maybe there's some small improvement in the way that people are able to implement them when they're asked to do so, but maybe less so when they're asking to report whether they use these strategies in everyday life. Also, a lot of these experimental paradigms, even though they're well controlled, and that's a really good thing for understanding the development of these processes, they tend to use quite artificial stimuli. So for example, seeing a picture of a snake may not be that relevant to a child's everyday life. So just summarising what we know so far, we know that poor emotional control is a hallmark of reactive aggressive behaviour. We also know that adolescence is a key time for the onset of reactive aggressive behaviour, or the intensifying of those behaviours. And also we have some evidence that emotion regulation abilities develop in adolescence, although much of the researchers use these sort of artificial stimuli. And surprisingly, considering the importance of emotional control, surprisingly few experimental studies have looked at the specific ways in which emotion regulation may be compromised in those showing high reactive aggression or anger, particularly in adolescence. So that led us to the present study. So I'll talk to you a little bit about the methods that we used. So we were focusing on cognitive reappraisal, so broadly getting people to change the meaning of an emotional stimulus in order to make themselves feel better. But it's a very, very broad term, and often studies looking at emotion regulation will ask people to use reappraisal strategies, but won't be able to get a firm handle on what people are actually doing when we ask them to do it. So we decided to focus in on a very specific strategy within reappraisal called temporal distancing. So for example, getting people to think, oh, well, this won't affect me in 5 years' time, this too shall pass. So just to give you an idea of how this works, let's try it now. So think of something that's been annoying you recently. Did you get stuck in traffic this morning? Is there something irritating you in your working life? And first of all, just kind of have it in your mind, something that's irritating you. And then take a step back and think about how you're likely to feel about this stressful thing during the summer break. And actually take a few moments to actually imagine yourself in the future. Don't just say to yourself, this is not going to affect me in 6 weeks' time. Actually, take a moment, close your eyes and project yourself into the future. Who feels a little bit better about it now? A few of you. Okay, great. Good, that's temporal distancing. And we decided to focus on this because a recent study had shown that temporal distancing reduces people's distress in relation to a personal life event in adults. So this study was looking at students who were about to take final exams, and they found that using temporal distancing reduced distress when thinking about this one specific real-life stressor. They also did a survey of how much people use this strategy in everyday life, and those who tended to use it more reported greater well-being, and this was after controlling for various other emotion regulation strategies and other factors that might impact that. So it seems that it's actually quite an effective strategy for people to be using in everyday life and in laboratory studies. However, the previous studies had only looked at relation to one life event, and so we wanted to develop a better controlled task where we were looking at people's reactions to lots of different stressful events instead of just one. And also, as I said before, a lot of the previous studies had used quite artificial stimuli that didn't really reflect adolescents' daily lives. So we used stressful events that were relevant to adolescents and young adults, such as failing exams and embarrassing themselves in front of their peers. And because we were interested in seeing development over the entire course of adolescence and into early adulthood, because these emotion regulation processes take a long time to develop, we looked at quite a wide age range, so age between 12 and 22 in this sample. And we looked also at self-reported reactive aggression, so we could look at individual differences in how good people were at using this strategy and how that related to reactive aggression. And these are my collaborators on the project. So this was the task. So this was a lab-based task, so people were sitting at a computer and thinking about various stressful events. So for example, first of all, they were given an instruction. So first of all, think of whether these situations would still affect you in the distant future. So this is the crucial condition where they're being asked to think about further ahead into the future. And then the stressor would come up, such as you fail an important exam. And then during that time, they've been asked to use the strategy, so thinking into the future as you just did. And after that, they rate how upset or anxious they feel. And we had various control conditions. So this was the condition where they were projecting themselves far into the future. We also had a condition where they just read the negative situation and decided how they felt about it just naturally. And we also had a near future condition where people were still projecting themselves into the future, but not so far ahead. So they were still using the same processes such as episodic future thinking, so creating a picture of the future, still doing exactly the same sorts of processes, but without the actual element of psychological distance. So this was a control condition, so we could see whether it was in fact distance, which was the important kind of active ingredient in helping people to control their emotions. And we wanted to look at individual differences in how far people projected themselves into the future as well. So we kept the instruction fairly broad, so distant versus near, and gave people broad examples of what we might expect. Near might be within a month, distant could be anything up to 10 years, but we didn't stipulate how far ahead people had to project themselves. So at the end of each trial for the distant and near conditions, we also asked them to rate how far into the future did they think of. And so we had three hypotheses. First, that the distancing condition would be most effective, importantly relative to both the read condition but also the near condition, suggesting that distancing itself was the important ingredient. We also thought that there would be development during adolescence of this, partly because we know that in general the ability to manage emotions is improving during this time, but also specifically with regard to temporal distancing. We know that adolescents are in many ways less good at representing the future. It's partly because they're younger and they don't necessarily have an idea of what's going to happen to them next, But also they tend to underrate the future. So for example, if I asked you, would you like £1 now or £2 in a week? Adolescents would be more likely to choose the reward now rather than waiting. So for all those reasons, we thought that maybe adolescents are not as good as adults at representing the future, and therefore may be less effective in implementing this strategy. And finally, we thought that those higher in reactive aggression would be less effective in using this strategy, possibly underscoring their difficulties in emotion regulation more generally. So hypothesis 1, overall efficacy. We did find that the distant condition was significantly more effective than either near or doing nothing. So that was good. It suggested that projecting yourself into the future is an effective emotion regulation strategy. And that was the case for all participants. Interestingly, we also found that the better people were at reducing their distress, the further they tended to project. So we have evidence from two lines of evidence suggesting that the distance is an important ingredient. So first of all, looking at this graph, distance seems to be more effective than near, but also looking at the free responses, so people were free to project themselves however far into the future they wanted. And those who on average projected themselves further tended to be more effective at regulating their emotions. So that suggests that distancing is an effective strategy, and that distance is a key ingredient. We also looked at skin conductance data. So one of the problems with just asking people to report how they feel in response to these scenarios is that there could be sort of social desirability effects, with people thinking, oh, I'm supposed to feel better during this condition. So we also thought we'd try and get a more objective measure. So skin conductance is a physiological measure of emotional response. It's basically based on measuring sweat responses from the fingers. And we found partial evidence for distancing efficacy using this measure. So you can see that the amount of skin conductance response, or sort of sweatiness of the fingers, was reduced for distant, and there was no difference between people reading distant scenarios and people reading neutral scenarios. However, you can see this bar here represents variability in the data, and you can see that actually there's quite a lot of variability, and skin conductance tends to be quite a noisy measure. So this meant that there wasn't a significant difference between distant and the near condition or reading negative. So it was kind of slightly disappointing that this measure didn't come out, but actually, based on what we know about skin conductance data, it is quite noisy. So self-reported data do suggest efficacy, and partial evidence from skin conductance data. What about development? So actually we were quite surprised and also quite pleased to find that the strategy was equally effective for all the participants. There wasn't actually evidence of development during adolescence, but it seemed to be quite an easily implemented strategy that was effective across all age groups. The only age effect we did find was in reactive aggression levels, which is in line with previous research. So we found a sort of quadratic trend with a peak in reactive aggression as self-reported by the participants around about mid-adolescence. And finally, hypothesis 3, what about reactive aggression? So what we found was that participants higher in reactive aggression were less successful in using temporal distancing to reduce their distress. So just to give you an idea of what this graph means, so the 0 line means that there's no advantage in using temporal distancing relative to simply just reading the scenarios. And so you can see that as self-reported reactive aggression increases, the benefit that people derive from actually using this strategy decreases. And we were interested a little bit in why this might be. So we also looked at those data where we asked people to rate how far in the future they projected themselves. And those participants higher in reactive aggression actually projected themselves less far into the future. So that's a potential mechanism for why this strategy might not have been so effective in this group. We also looked a bit more closely at these distress ratings to try and understand the relationship with reactive aggression. So one thing we thought was maybe those children who were higher in reactive aggression were so distressed by initially reading the stressful scenarios that that kind of high level of distress made it then difficult for them to implement the instruction to distance themselves. But actually the data don't suggest that. So when we looked at the relationship between reactive aggression and distress when they were simply reading the scenarios, we found basically a flat line, so no relationship between distress when reading the scenarios and reactive aggression. It did seem to be specific to the emotion regulation instruction itself. So those higher in reactive aggression actually seem less able to implement the temporal distancing instruction as instructed to do so. So the take-home messages. Firstly, good news, temporal distancing is an effective strategy, and that's for both adolescents and adults alike, and it's a very easily implemented strategy. However, the strategy was less effective for those reporting high levels of reactive aggression. And in this sample at least, aggression was a more important factor than age in predicting success in using this strategy. Interestingly, these individuals spontaneously projected themselves less far into the future when they were given a free choice of how far to do that. And I suppose basically we need to take account of individual differences when we're thinking about emotion regulation strategies. So there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach to emotion regulation. One thing that I've thought about for the future is whether it might be possible to improve temporal distancing through training in this group. So for example, if we were to say, actually try and project yourself a little bit further ahead, that might, given that prompt, might improve efficacy in using this strategy. And then again, it's an open empirical question whether that would in turn improve well-being and reactive aggressive behaviour, or whether actually what you need is an entirely different approach with that group of children. So just want to finish by thanking all my collaborators and participants and families, and thanks for your attention.
And I thought that tied in really nicely with Kathy's message about direct instruction. Perhaps if we encourage them, then it will help even more. Do we have any questions from the audience? Helen?
I was interested in how much the kids with reactive aggression could stick with the thoughts of distancing themselves. So was it that they couldn't project themselves further into the future, or did they lose focus actually? Concentration on the task. I don't know whether there's some way.
Did everybody hear that question at the back? Can you hear? No? Okay, the question that was asked.
I was just asking whether the children with reactive aggression, whether the issue was that they couldn't project themselves further and far enough into the future, or that they were getting distracted from the task itself. They were a bit more lacking in concentration and impulsive. I don't know whether the data can tell you that, or.
Yeah, so I don't have data that would directly speak to that. However, one follow-up study that I thought would be really interesting to conduct is slightly relevant to that. So I was interested in what people are actually doing during that time, so when they're implementing the instruction. So we were quite careful in that we were wanting them to really mentally visualize the future, which is which is more difficult than just kind of potentially just saying, oh, this won't affect me in 5 years' time. And we could look at things like vividness of mental imagery to really kind of capture how good people actually were at doing that. So yeah, you're right, it could be something to do with the way in which they were staying on task and implementing that instruction. I suppose one thing we could do is look at things like ADHD symptoms and see if that plays in at all. But yeah, I think it's quite an interesting question. All we have is the information on how far they projected themselves into the future. And I guess you might have thought, if it was simply that they weren't paying attention, they might still say they projected themselves as far into the future, but then they, the efficacy levels would be reduced anyway. So I suppose that data does slightly suggest there's something more to it than that, but yeah, we don't have the direct evidence.
I mean, maybe you need to do something beforehand about seeing how well they could project, they could see themselves in the future. Some children, some people might not have as vivid an idea of what they're going to do. Some others will. So you kind of have to see that first. Anything for you.
Did everybody hear that comment?
Well, what we had done at least was to make sure that all the stimuli were matched for, so a pilot sample looked at the stimuli and thought how far in the future they would likely affect someone's life. So we had thought a little bit about the stimuli that we used and how far ahead they would likely affect someone's life. I think our developmental predictions were kind of driven by what you were saying, that we thought that the younger individuals would find it harder than the older individuals to create an image of the future, and for that to help to reduce their distress. So we were slightly surprised to see that didn't happen. It could be that rather than age being the important factor, there's just individual differences between children, which is more important than age, in visualizing the future, which is partly why I thought this kind of vividness of mental imagery aspect might get at that. But equally, yeah, there could be other aspects. Like I'd quite like to look at those sorts of tasks where you decide between £1 now and £2 in a week to see whether that sort of valuing of the future impacts on ability to use this strategy. Yeah, so there's a lot of really interesting follow-ups that we can do with this.
Another one is the different areas of brains being used. So for reactive aggression, it'd be the limbic circuit, but for self-regulation and projecting into the future, it's everything in front of them, isn't it?
Yeah, so
that might not be well developed in children that have reactive aggression.
Yeah, so that's, actually,
that doesn't actually relate to vividness of imaging, because that again is a different area of the brain, isn't it?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because we actually have some neuroimaging data in an adult sample using this strategy, and we had predicted that we would see areas of the brain involved in mental imagery, so things like hippocampus and medial prefrontal cortex, and also areas of the brain involved in inhibitory control. And actually, what we found was a bit surprising. We found more evidence of brain regions involved in inhibitory control than those involved in mental imagery. So, yeah, we were a little bit surprised that mental imagery didn't work. So in general, if you look at emotion regulation tasks kind of overall, there's regions involved in what's called inhibitory control in prefrontal cortex, as you were mentioning, that consistently come up. And so we thought this kind of strategy may involve those circuits, but they may also involve a wider circuitry involved in mental imagery. But actually still the strongest result was regarding inhibitory control regions. So I think regarding reactive aggression, yeah, I think it could definitely be the case that it's weaknesses in those control mechanisms that are still feeding into not being able to implement this strategy effectively. That reminds me, shameless plug, my PhD student Rachel is conducting an imaging study and a school-based study looking at emotion regulation in reactive aggression, particularly looking at frustration aggression, so that sort of wanting to bang on the keyboard kind of aggression. She's looking for schools to take part. She's at the back there. So at lunchtime, if you're interested in chatting to Rachel, I'm sure she'd really appreciate it.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Kath.
Thank you.
Okay, And now it's an enormous pleasure to invite Dr. Eilidh Cage to tell us about her research or some ideas about autism myths. And this is the final talk of this session, so thank you very much, Eilidh.
Thank you, Jessie. So I'm Eilidh Cage. I'm a teaching fellow here at Royal Holloway. My talk has fallen under the mental health category, but I would have to just clarify that autism is not a mental health condition. We see mental health difficulties a lot in autism. But today, what I'll be talking about is a few different autism myths and how recent research challenges perceptions of autism. I'll be talking a bit about my own research. I'll be talking about some of our colleagues here at Royal Holloway and also some other researchers from around the world. Some of the things I talk about might not be myths to you, but hopefully there might be a few things that you can take home for your own practice. I thought it would make sense though just to start by defining and explaining exactly what autism is, just in case there's anyone here who is less familiar with autism. So when psychologists are trying to define and diagnose autism, what they're looking for are certain behaviours, and these behaviours fall under two categories. So first of all, we're looking for difficulties in social communication. So this will include things like having difficulties in making and maintaining friendships, perhaps having difficulties with understanding non-verbal communication. Secondly, we look for repetitive behaviours and restricted interests. So here this would include things like having an insistence on the same routine and being quite upset when that routine is disrupted. And in terms of restricted interests, these are like special interests in a certain topic or person or something in life that they're just really fascinated by, and they want to know as much as possible about that topic and to tell other people about that interest. Now, autism in itself is very diverse, which is why it falls well under today's general topic of pupil diversity, because within the autism spectrum we see a vast amount of diversity, and we typically see diversity amongst expressive language level. So you'll have individuals who are very highly articulate, and then you'll have others who are perhaps non-verbal. Then we see differences as well in level of severity, so how much support the individual needs in everyday life. Now, there are different ways in which we can refer to autism. We can either use what is known as identity-first language, where we will say autistic person, or we can use person-first language, where we can say person with autism. Now, what I'd like to do is just ask everyone here what your preferences are and which term you prefer. So just a show of hands, who here prefers the term autistic person? Who prefers the term person with autism? Okay, well, you've led nicely to my first myth, and this is the idea that we should be using person-first language, person with autism. So the reason this is a myth is because recent research has gone and asked members of the autism community which terms they prefer. And here, what the research found is that 61% of autistic adults themselves preferred the term autistic person, and only 28% liked the term person with autism. Then when we look at what the professionals said, including teachers, clinicians, we see the reverse here. 38% of the professionals endorsed autistic person, and around half preferred person with autism. Now, the reason I think this is important and interesting is these researchers asked the participants about their language preferences and why they prefer to use certain terms over others. And I think this quote sums up quite nicely why saying autistic person was okay for this individual. So separating the person from their autism is damaging, as it reinforces opinions about autism being a thing that can be removed, something that may be unpleasant and unwanted. Describing oneself as autistic is an extremely important and positive assertion about oneself. It means that one feels complete and whole as one is. So for many individuals on the autism spectrum, autism is an integral part of who they are. It cannot be separated from them. It's like being a woman. I am a woman, I am not a person with femaleness. It is part of who I am. And so we have to think about the fact that for so many people, autism is just who they are and it's not separable, and they actually do take pride in the fact that they are on the autism spectrum. And so what this means in practice, it might seem like something quite minor, but I think we should think about the language that we use when we talk about autism, and think about what autistic people themselves say and what they prefer. But of course, there will be lots of different opinions on this, but most importantly, I think, if you're working with young people with autism, to ask them what they prefer. They might have different opinions to adults on the autism spectrum. And in fact, my own research, which is starting very soon, will be looking at what adolescents on the autism spectrum think about their identity. Do they see autism as part of their identity? Do they prefer autistic person or person with autism? And so perhaps next year or the year after, I'll be able to tell you the results of that research. So, given the fact that autism is known to affect social communication and social life, there might be this idea that perhaps autistic individuals don't care about what other people think about them, that they exist in their own kind of world, oblivious to others. But, as my own PhD research showed, this is not correct. In fact, many autistic individuals do care about what other people think about them. Now, I found a distinction here. So what we see with non-autistic people is we tend to be very subconsciously aware of other people, and we automatically regulate our behaviour when others are around. But we don't see that kind of automatic regulation in autism. But what we do see is the kind of more deliberate, conscious self-presentation. The ability to realise, oh, everyone's watching me in this talk, I need to present myself in a certain way. Or I'm doing a job interview, I'll need to show myself all my positive aspects. Now, people on the autism spectrum might not be as good at that self-presentation, but they can still do it. It's not totally impossible for them. What I did find in my research, though, was lots of individual differences. But I think this is true for the non-autistic population too. There'll be people in this room who, frankly, don't care what other people think. And then there'll be others who deeply, deeply care too much about what other people think. And we see the same within the autism spectrum. As part of my PhD research, I also conducted a small interview study talking to adolescents on the autism spectrum and about their experiences and how they felt about other people. What I found really interesting was the fact that some of the adolescents talked about how they really wanted to fit in with their peers. They wanted to be accepted, but they wanted to be accepted for being who I am. Now, I think this is the challenge here, because often who they were was a bit different to their non-autistic peers. And unfortunately, what we know is that autistic individuals are more likely to get bullied, and non-autistic teenagers are often not so accepting of people who are a bit different. So there's a bit of a challenge there. You want to be fitting in with your peers, but you want to fit in because of who you are, but they're not necessarily accepting that. So it's a bit of a challenge there. So what this means in practice, well, I think it's important to think about the social world and how it is important to individuals on the autism spectrum. They might have different preferences, and they might do things differently. But many autistic people still want friends, and if we can, we should be able to support them to try and get the friendships that they want. So another myth that exists out there is this idea that those on the autism spectrum don't have empathy. Now, anecdotally, if you've spoken to someone with autism about empathy, they often say how intensely they experience empathy. they experience it so much that it becomes almost personally distressing, and they actually have to withdraw from the situation because it's just too much to handle. So it might look like they're not being empathetic, but actually it's just because it's too much and they need to step back. Now, what recent research by one of our new colleagues here at Royal Holloway, Rebecca Brewer,